Good afternoon. Welcome to FTA's third listening session. To get us started, we will turn to Linda Tran, Director of Public Engagement and Senior Advisor to Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. I'm Linda Tran, Senior Advisor to the Secretary and Director of Public Engagement at the Department of Transportation. On behalf of FTA Administrator Noria Fernandez, I want to welcome all of you to the third and final installment of FTA's series of listening sessions for its Transit Renewal Initiative, highlighting best practices that help reinforce that America is open and transit is open. For folks who don't know me, this is actually my second tour of duty at the United States Department of Transportation. I also served at DOT during the Obama administration. And candidly, I had not planned to go back into the federal government. But what drew me back to public service is the tremendous challenge and the unprecedented opportunities our communities face at this unique moment in our nation's history. And it was ultimately hearing directly from Secretary Buttigieg, his commitment to transportation equity and his focus on addressing and righting generational wrongs that called me back. The Secretary is crystal clear about the need to introduce and include new voices in the policymaking process, voices that haven't always been in the room, whose ideas and concerns born of lived experience can strengthen everything we're doing here at DOT. That seems like a good place to start. Today, our panelists will focus on building partnerships in communities. We all know it takes effective partnerships between transit agencies, local and state governments, businesses, and advocacy organizations to create real change in the transportation systems in our communities. We're excited to learn from all of you what's worked well and where we can apply similar strategies to the work ahead. I began my career more than 2 decades ago as a community organizer, first working for a local state representative candidate in East Texas, later organizing janitors, public employees, nurses, and other hospital workers for the Service Employees International Union. And the lessons I learned from those early experiences remain with me to this very day, especially and above all else, that it is as important to listen as it is to spread the gospel. That guiding principle has served me in all the work I've done since then, from the presidential level to the community level. Put simply, I believe that developing authentic feedback loops, continually gathering feedback, and opening pathways for and empowering individuals to be change agents is the best way to learn the issues in a community and give voice to people's everyday challenges. In the case of SEIU, we learned about the economic challenges of living in some cases on less than $20 pay a day, about patient safety issues related to mandatory overtime, and so much more, including what life is like when you have to take multiple forms of transit or rely on others to get to work and then get back home every single day. We learned how tackling issues like these would improve quality of life for working people in communities across the country. To this day, the average commute time for frontline workers is about an hour a day. Public transit commuters have double the commute time of non-transit commuters. And people of color are twice as likely to rely on public transit to get to and from work. Seniors and people with disabilities often rely exclusively on public transit. It is our obligation and our imperative to continue to provide safe and efficient transit services. As you all know, Congress is currently considering the largest investment in transit in American history. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that just passed the Senate on Tuesday and will now move to the House of Representatives would provide $550 billion in new federal investment to fix our aging infrastructure. That will help a lot of these working people I have the privilege of supporting, and everyone else in the country. The infrastructure bill includes funding dedicated to transitioning the fleet to zero-emission vehicles and resources to train the transit workforce to maintain and operate those vehicles. Public transit will play a critical role in helping to achieve President Biden's climate goals and address the climate crisis. And this approach allows us to do that while carrying out the promise to be the most pro-worker administration in history. As part of the president's Build Back Better agenda, this bill will allow us to finally look seriously at incorporating equity with $39 billion in new funding over the next 5 years to modernize our transit system and make more transit stations accessible for people with disabilities, for tribal residents, inner city residents, people in rural communities, and for those who don't have cars or cannot drive. These are exciting times. But as I said at the start, we are faced with both great challenges and opportunities. And we're relying on each of you to help us ensure we're doing this work in the most equitable and inclusive way possible. So today, we're going to continue that listening first approach that the president and the secretary both swear by. We will capture ideas and feedback from all of you who are joining us from communities around the country, and your thoughts will inform what FDA does moving forward. We look forward to a robust conversation. With that, I'm happy to turn the conversation over to my colleague, Orlando Teller. He's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Tribal Affairs here at USDOT. Before being appointed to his current post, Orlando served a term in the Arizona State Senate and spent most of his career at the Navajo Division of Transportation, based in Window Rock, Arizona. Orlando?
Yeah, thank you, Linda. I appreciate that introduction. And welcome to today's third listening session devoted to restoring our transit ridership. My name is Orlando Teller, and my Navajo clans are My clans, again in English, are Zuni people adopted into the Red Streak Forehead clan, born for the Water Flows Together clan. My maternal grandparents are of the Bitterwater people, and my paternal grandfathers are of the Salt people. And I am honored to serve in the capacity of the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Tribal Affairs at USDOT. I take this position very seriously, as this position has been vacant from the last administration. So the voices of our tribal communities, of our tribal leadership, of our tribal brothers and sisters across this great nation has been minimized. So this opportunity to express and encourage intergovernmental, government to government discussions, including representation, as well as advocacy for opportunities across the board, which include our tribal brothers and sisters, when it comes to transportation connectivity, is very important and critical and crucial to the viability of all communities throughout this great nation. Communities such as tribes and small rural communities are really rely heavily on transit, rely heavily on transportation. And so my position and my opportunity here is to advocate for those folks throughout this country. As Linda shared, my previous experience has been with as a legislator in Legislative District 7 in Arizona, where I represented not only 7 counties and 8 tribes, but in Arizona, all 22 tribes. And prior to that, I was a deputy director for Navajo DOT, again, working and advocating for the largest tribal transportation program in the United States. Transit was the #1 concern and issue on the Navajo Nation, a reservation, a nation the size of West Virginia, larger than 10 states and 11 countries, spanning across 3 states and 14 counties. It was important for us to safely transport our community members, elderly all the way to the youth, to communities throughout Navajo. And with that in mind, I know that transit programs, transit ridership has been deeply affected by this pandemic, and that we're in the move to improve our riderships, not only in tribal communities, but in rural communities across America. And so with that, I am so honored to be providing a welcome address to you all for us to engage and also interact with our leadership at FTA, our leadership at USDOT, and including leadership throughout this great nation. At every agency that's on this call, I sincerely appreciate your interaction, your dialogue. And so with that, I am honored to kick this back to Paul, but before then, thank you very much. Paul?
Thanks, Yolanda. We're grateful that you and Linda could kick off our listening session today on behalf of the Biden-Harris administration. It means a lot to get this kind of support from the Secretary's office as well. My name is Paul Kincaid, and I lead communications and congressional affairs here at FTA. Many of you who've listened to our two previous sessions have met me already, but for those who haven't, I was appointed to this role in June. Like Linda, it's my second time at DOT, having served in the final year of the Obama administration in this very same office. The job and the people I work with remain outstanding, and I'm very happy to be back. Today, we're excited to focus on the important role that transit plays in communities across America. We've assembled an impressive list of speakers joining us from across the country. I'm very happy to hear their perspectives from different parts of the United States, and I also want to thank the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia, for providing us with Dr. Nikki Cohen for this session to take back some of the things we talk about here to the leadership of the CDC, who are so valuable in helping us stop the spread of COVID-19 throughout the transportation industry. To get us started, I'd like to introduce some members of FTA's wonderful regional team. In addition to overseeing billions of dollars of federal funding, our regional administrators interact with dozens of transit agencies each week. First, Pete Butler, who has worked in the transit industry for over 30 years in positions of increasing responsibility at the local, state, and federal levels. He came to FTA in 1999 as Director of Planning and Program Development and was promoted to Deputy Regional Administrator in 2011. He became FTA's Region 1 Administrator in 2019. Also joining us today is Linda Gerke. Linda is FTA's Region 10 Administrator based in Seattle, Washington. Linda's been with FTA for more than 20 years. She served in several leadership roles, including serving as Regional Administrator for Region 8 in Denver for 4 years and Deputy Regional Administrator for Region 10 for 14. Finally, wrapping up today's session will be Kelly Brookins, Regional Administrator in Region 5 in Chicago, Illinois. Kelly joined FTA in 2014 as the Deputy Regional Administrator in Region 5, and she was promoted to the top leadership post there in 2018. We greatly appreciate Pete, Linda, and Kelly's leadership, and I'd like to turn it over to them, starting out with Pete.
Great. Thank you, Paul. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you from FTA's Region 1 office in Cambridge. Today, we are focused on how transit systems interact with Americans as a vital part of communities. Transit agencies throughout the Northeast have become important parts of their communities, not just providing a travel option to get to work, but also to deliver critical life services. For example, the Greater Portland Council of Governments in Maine started a weekly shopper shuttle service to help older adults, people with disabilities, and those with lower incomes get to the grocery store. This door-to-door service was supported with a federal grant from the FTA-supported National Aging and Disability Transportation Center. This summer, the Council is also working to encourage riders to get on board the 7 Portland area transit systems to help support communities and local businesses as they look to make up lost revenue from 2020. Its Transit Together campaign includes TV commercials, newspaper ads, and social media promoting transit. One of their most effective spots highlights transit workers, mechanics, bus drivers, office workers, reminding folks that they can save money, help the environment, and beat the traffic by getting out of their cars and taking transit. Before launching the campaign, the Greater Portland COG convened a focus group with diverse participants, including folks with minority and refugee communities and people with disabilities, to gather ideas from the community it serves on what they need from their transit systems. Today's session is an important opportunity to learn more about listening to our community partners to promote positive public messages. I'm looking forward to learning more. But first, let me turn it over to my colleague, Linda Gerke. Linda?
Thanks, Pete. I'm joining today from the Seattle, Washington. Region 10 is home to one of the nation's largest transit providers, Sound Transit. Sound Transit has an ambitious schedule of integrated projects to extend its light rail, commuter rail, and bus systems throughout the Puget Sound. But to help address the housing crisis here in Seattle, Sound Transit has made it a priority to partner with communities to create affordable housing. The Sound Transit Board approved an equitable transit-oriented development policy committed to promoting development on Sound Transit properties that reflect the community's needs. And to date, Sound Transit TOD program has built or plans to build more than 1,500 affordable housing units on Sound Transit surplus property. Recently, Sound Transit entered into an agreement with Amazon to speed up the program. Residents will not only have affordable homes, but they will live near transit. That means many of them might forego driving, another major savings for their wallet as well as the environment. I also want to mention some of the work our tribal transit partners are doing to support their communities. In Region 10, we currently support 65 tribal transit systems in the Pacific Northwest and Alaska. One thing I've observed over the years working with tribal transit leaders is their incredible commitment to their people. For many tribal communities, transit is the link to basic needs such as shopping, healthcare, employment, education, and leisure. This year, tribal transit systems have been key in helping people get access to COVID vaccines. Tribes were among the first priority groups to receive vaccines. Last February, Whatcom Transportation Authority in Bellingham, Washington, was finding it challenging to get shots for their frontline transit workers, even as they face considerable risk every day. When Whatcom's workforce was still not eligible for COVID-19 vaccine by mid-March, members of the neighboring Lummi Nation in Northwest Washington stepped in with a generous offer. They would provide enough vaccines to vaccinate most of WTA's workforce at the Lummi Tribal Health Center, an offer that was gratefully accepted. And here's one more. This year's record fire season in the Pacific Northwest has consumed thousands of acres, destroyed homes, and threatened lives. Last month, the Colville Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation, located in Nespelem, Washington, used FTA's funded vehicles to evacuate residents in the towns of Nespelem and Keller ahead of the Whitmore fire. These heroic actions by our transit partners makes me proud to work at FTA, and I appreciate the opportunity to highlight that today. Before I turn it back over to FTA's Paul Kincaid, it is my pleasure to introduce Jerry Hope, Transportation Director of the Sitka Tribe of Alaska and Vice President of the Intertribal Transportation Association, which works to improve transportation infrastructure for tribal nations and Alaska Native villages. We have asked him and the rest of the panel to discuss their experiences in building community partnerships as part of renewing transit. Later in our program, we will hear from Hester Cerebrant, who also works in my city, Seattle, for the Transportation Choices Coalition and sits on the Washington State Transportation Commission. But before we get to her, Jerry joins us from Alaska today. Jerry?
Thank you, Linda. It's my pleasure to be presenter on this panel. And I do thank FTA for inviting the Intertribal Transportation Association. By way of Orlando Teller's traditional introduction, if you will forgive me for just a minute, I am Tlingit. We have moieties. My moiety is the wolf eagle. We are matrilineal, so that means we follow our mother's lineage. And so I am Siknachati from the Wrangell, Alaska area. We have the crests of the brown bear and the killer whale. We come from the red clay house. While we are matrilineal, we honor our father's side. So that means that I'm a child of the Kikseti here in Sitka. My father was from the Raven moiety, and they claim the frog crest and come from the Point House. As previously identified, being vice president of the Intertribal Transportation Association, that's a national tribal organization. And I'm also president of the Alaska Tribal Transportation Work Group. So I thank you, Linda, for also identifying my day-to-day work as a transportation director for Sitka Tribe of Alaska. Next slide, please. I was asked to talk about building partnerships, and that is a critical component for ITA. In ITA, we adopted our strategic plan in February 26th of this year, and we have officers, the president, Mary Beth Frank Clark, who is president of the ITA and hails from the Nez Perce tribe in Idaho. Me, as mentioned, and Sarah K. Yaki is our treasurer. She hails from the organized village of Kasan here in Alaska. Jonah Begay is our secretary. He hails from the Navajo Nation. As most of you know, it has a broad swath of land, including Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. We have regional representatives of 12 regions who are eligible to elect one representative and one alternate across the country that have tribes located in their respective states. Next slide, please. A little bit of a just touch on the history and vision. ITA was established in 1993, primarily as an advocacy in tribal transportation infrastructure and tribal transit. Vision, part of the vision, as you'll see, ITA is dedicated to enhancing the development of tribal transportation in Indian country, to improving the capabilities of tribal transportation and tribal transit programs, and assisting member tribes of ITA and their governments in dealing effectively with tribal transportation policy issues and in serving the broad needs of tribal nation citizens. Next slide, please. In building effective partnerships, we'll touch on this on 3 bullet points. I'll expand a little bit of discussion on this though. First bullet point, opportunities to grow in the knowledge and expertise within the organization are key strategies to further enhance the effectiveness of the ITA organization. Secondly, ITA has monthly virtual meetings. In addition, ITA has 2 committees, the Operations Committee and the Governance Committee. Kim Stubbe, who hailed from the Cowlitz Indian Tribe in Washington, was the chair of the Operations Committee. From what I understand, Kim has moved on and has a different job. So we have a vacancy in that particular committee for chairmanship. And then the Governance Committee, I was requested to chair that, and I was happy to do so and am happy to do so. The Operations Committee is primarily focused on internal elements of ITA, while governance is focused on external elements outside of ITA. Which brings us to the 3rd bullet point. Along with the Federal Highway Administration, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Federal Transit Administration remain very important. I will just expand a little bit of the discussion from the text here, as that's my last slide. ITA really feels strongly that FTA is a critical component in trying to address the broad swath of transportation infrastructure needs across tribal governments in our beautiful country. We lag behind in serious ways in terms of budgets, in terms of ability, and in terms of I would parallel it to perhaps 3rd world country conditions. And so we have a long way to go. Fortunately, with people like Linda Gerke in Region 10 that Alaska is tied into, has developed a real strong working relationship with FTA Region 10. I believe there are other regions as well, although I cannot speak for them, that also work with tribes. And also ITA has worked with various administrations and are really excited to work with the Biden administration to see how we can make these kinds of large steps into what is necessary to fill the needs for Indian country. Thank you.
And thank you, Cherry. We appreciate you highlighting these important issues about building community to renew ridership and your work on behalf of tribal nations. Next, we want to continue to hear from our more advocacy organizations and community groups discussing their work with transit systems. I'd like to turn to Jim Bowinski, Chair of the Commuter Rail Coalition Board and CEO and Executive Director of Metra in Chicago. CRC does great work representing commuter rail across America. Jim?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone for inviting me to be part of this important conversation. As you stated, I'm the CEO and Executive Director of Metra. For those of you who don't know what Metra is, it's the commuter rail operator here in Chicago. We cover about 3,400 square miles, run 11 lines, and prior to the pandemic, we're running 700 revenue trains a day. And as pointed out, I am the chair of the Commuter Rail Association, an association of commuter rail operators and interested parties to further transit. Next slide, please. 3 examples that I'd really like to talk to you about with partnerships today are the Return to Work Summit that we did here in Chicago, the Commuter Rail Coalition itself, and the Fair Transit South Cook pilot program. Next slide. Metra realized very early on during the pandemic that we were going to need partners. And the recovery was going to have to be a much broader conversation involving supporting partners to sustain and eventually rebuild ridership. This March, we hosted the Return to Work Summit with all the partners listed on the screen. The goals were to have a conversation about safe travels on transit, safe practices in buildings. The infectious disease expert, Dr. Robert Murphy of Northwestern Medicine, discussed the virus and the current status at that time of the infection, the vaccinations that were coming out. We also had the CEO of BMO Harris Bank. He came in and discussed the need for in-person collaboration and getting back into the office. Right after that summit, we started seeing a great increase in ridership. Next slide. The CRC itself formed in April of 2019. So we're fairly young, and we engage and educate stakeholders about the value and the needs of commuter in this country. Throughout the pandemic, we met quite often over the past 18 months to share both good and bad experiences. What's going on with cleanliness, sanitation, ridership? What are you doing with fares? How's the recovery going? It's all about lessons learned. It was about a partnership of trying to make sure that if someone makes a mistake, we didn't repeat the mistake. And if somebody did something really well, we wanted to basically share that across our coalition. We meet with those sister agencies on a normal basis. Another partnership that CRC worked with was the National Association of Realtors. Throughout the country, there's been a lot of movement of where people are living. We discussed housing trends and how commuter across the country could be ready to meet the needs of many new residents to the areas that we serve. Next slide. A great one here is in January of 2021, Metra partnered with Cook County and Pace, the suburban bus operator here in the region, and we launched a 3-year pilot funded by Cook County. It had 3 core objectives: reduce the fares, increase service levels, and eventually fare integration. Phase 1 launched this January and is underway on 2 of our 11 lines. And Pace also increased service that feeds those lines. It provides residents in more transit-dependent communities a greater opportunity to make transit their choice for commuting. On this phase, we lowered the fares by 50% on those 2 lines. In the coming years, Phase 2 and Phase 3 will work with the other service boards on hopefully what becomes fare integration. As pointed out earlier, having a better commute is better for everyone, and having to pay multiple different times inside the same region doesn't work for people. Next slide. Similar to many of the other commuter railroads across the country, we saw a very large dip in ridership, very dramatic dip when the pandemic hit. Just before the pandemic hit, we were doing about 80 million trips a year. Commuter rail as a nation was doing about 500 million trips a year. At our low point, we fell down to 2.5% of our pre-COVID ridership. This graph represents what's been going on over the last 12 months, and now we're up to about 25%. It's a good trend. And it's because of several of our partnerships and the communication efforts that we've been using here in Chicago that we're starting to see this. Commuter is definitely open. Next slide. One key partnership with the riding is our riding public. And in July of this year, we launched 4 brand new pilot schedules. By listening to our public and also listening with other commuter agencies across the country of what the public needs, we launched these new pilots. They spread out the peak period, make it more flexible, providing more choices throughout the course of the day and more frequent, memorable service patterns throughout the day. And how do we know that's going to work? Well, we did something else. We put out this survey on the bottom of the screen, first in the country, where we can actually have onboard people tell us how we're doing, and we can use real-time data to make sure that we're listening to the partners that we have out there in our ridership itself. Next slide. I often say commuter was green before green was ever invented. Removing tens of thousands of autos per hour off of area roadways during every rush hour. There's no better environmental choice for people commuting large groups over several miles to several dozen miles. We decongest roadways. We're 18 times safer than being on those roadways and possibly even higher now. Metra's leading the way. We have an RFP out there right now to look at the industry to see if we can convert several of our diesel locomotives to the first in the country for commuter, all battery powered locomotives. We stand ready to align with new partners in this exciting time. I look forward to the rest of the presentation and thank you again. Back to you, Paul.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks for sharing those great examples at Metra. To continue our panel discussion, I'll turn it over now to Alva Carrasco. She's the president of the Board of Directors for Latinos in Transit. Joining us from the Bay Area, Administrator Nuria Fernandez was a founding member and has been an enthusiastic participant in the Latinos in Transit group for many years. Alva, we truly appreciate your perspective.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for having me and for inviting me to be part of today's listening session. Today, I'll be speaking about building community partnerships with Latino communities. Construyendo sociedades comunitarias. Next slide, please. Latinos continue to face transportation inequities. 27% of Latinos rely on public transit every day, compared to 14% of whites. 57% of Latinos are considered housing cost burden, which means that Latinos pay more than 30% of their income for housing and may have difficulty affording necessities such as food, clothes, transportation, and medical services. In addition, inequities include having to travel farther distances for work and other essential destinations, unsafe streets, unsafe walking and biking environments, and have limited access to public transportation. Next slide. Continuous inequities in land use, planning, transportation policies, and capital investments tend to harm Latinos and low-income communities. They mostly promote auto use or prioritize peak services for white-collar workers. Structural racism still persists, and public agencies tend to work in silos. Decision makers lack diversity. Public outreach and engagement efforts fail to meaningfully engage Latinos in the decision-making process. Next slide. Current engagement methodologies limit Latino engagement and are disproportionately focused on the needs of non-Latinos. When planning meetings, careful consideration of language is imperative. I know what you're thinking, having a translator checks the box. However, dialects among Latinos vary as much as recipes for arroz con pollo. A translator is good, but a meeting held in all Spanish is much better. The time of day meetings are held also matters greatly. Latinos and low-income families work multiple jobs and don't work banker's hours. They are less likely to take off of work, lose pay to attend a meeting. Weekday meetings during dinner time is the least convenient time for Latinos. Improve engagement by offering childcare, food, access to transportation, and/or stipends for their time. Do not hold meetings in government buildings or where there's heavy police presence. Remember that Latinos, especially immigrants, do not trust the government. Utilize engagement tools such as surveys, flyers, and wayfinding in Spanish. Include Spanish language radio in your media plan and use apps such as WhatsApp. WhatsApp is more popular among US Hispanics than Instagram or Twitter, with those platforms seeing 34% and 21% user penetration respectively. Partner with community leaders and organizations before you begin outreach activities. Increase Latino representation in the planning and decision-making process. Next slide. In order to do a better job funding and investing in equitable transportation projects, we need better data regarding existing inequities and Latino travel patterns. We also really need to prioritize access over mobility, people over cars, and pedestrians over the car, address gaps in where affordable housing and transportation coexist. Performance metrics should be based on social, environmental, and health outcomes, and invest in projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, such as zero-emission buses. Lastly, I would be remiss if I didn't promote the importance of partnering with local minority-owned businesses. Next slide. The lack of diversity in our industry is negatively impacting our ability to provide innovation. According to a survey in 2013 by the American Planning Association, nearly 1 in 10 planners, or 88% of practicing planners, self-identified as white. As an industry, we need more diverse hiring practices, and we need to train relevant staff in equity, implicit bias, cultural sensitivity, past and present discriminatory planning practices, and the impacts of an auto-centric status quo. Hire Latinos with backgrounds in public health, social justice, and other disciplines that focus on equity. And invest in Latino employees for future leadership positions in your organizations. Build a pipeline for Latinos. You can start as early as junior high school. Case in point, you're listening to a former Santa Monica's Big Blue Bus student worker. To hammer this home, build partnerships with Latinos in your communities, appoint them to serve on boards and committees. They will be the project's biggest advocates. Next slide. Were these bus stops planned for the choice rider or the transit dependent? The slide is not here to shame any agency. We all have these in our systems. This is to serve as a reminder that we have a lot of work ahead of us. Next slide. To close out on a positive note, this is my favorite bus stop transformation story. 5 Points in San Antonio was a blighted and unsafe intersection that served as a major bus stop. When redesigning this stop, Via Metro staff carefully considered the needs of its passengers and the community. All passengers deserve the best services possible. Next slide, please. I hope you take away at least one nugget from my presentation today. I've provided a link to my cited information from the Salud America report. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you. Back to you, Paul.
Thank you, Ala. That was really informative and an excellent reminder that we really have to consider different ways to reach out to different communities throughout our country. It's obvious that equity is a very important part of the Biden-Harris administration, and we hope to consider all of the things that you just talked about as we move forward here at FPA. Next, we'll move to our panel of national advocacy organizations. We'll start with Tanya Adams. She's the board chair for COMTO, the Conference on Minority Transportation Officials. FTA has had a long and productive partnership with COMTO, so I'm really happy Tanya could join us today from Chicago. Tanya?
Thank you so much, Paul. Next slide. So I'm Tanya Adams. I'm the Vice President of Inclusion and Diversity for the US here. But most important, I am the National Chair for COMTO. COMTO was made up of 35 chapters across the country. Next slide. COMTO cannot stress enough about the importance of community engagement between transit agencies and the communities where we live and serve. This engagement is how we truly understand what is needed to make sure we have fair and equitable transit system across this country. It's how we get the pulse of what is needed in our communities versus what we think they need. I'd like to share a few examples of how COMTO's 35 chapters, in conjunction with our 55 transit agencies that we work with, serve together in communities. It is in these interactions that trust is built and relationships are cultivated, and where we share information. I have to say, with COVID going on, our chapters have been working with the agencies to make sure that we have taken care of our first line workers, that our communities have what they need, that they have transportation to be able to get to where they can get their vaccine. You know, there've been times that they've been at local grocery stores, but we know we have deserts in some of our communities. And providing transportation to get to those locations was needed, and Compto and the transportation agency stepped up. Another outreach that we've been doing is working in the community with our young people, from the smallest ages of kindergarten all the way up into our college students, making sure that they understand that there are opportunities out there for them and making sure they have scholarships. I have to say a shout out to our CREATE program, which is the transit agency in Chicago with Metra, PACE, CTA, RTA, where we're working with young kids to make sure that they're able to learn what's going on in the project and look at the transit as a way of having a new career. I have to say that we've been working with making sure there's listening tours that include diversity, inclusion, equity, and quality with our stakeholders out there. We've been engaging with our communities to make sure that our DBE partners are getting great percentages on the work that they do. This is key to make sure that we're having inclusion and equity on our projects. Next slide. We're looking at emerging and current transit needs. It is clear community engagement is an essential element of our program development. It provides the foundation for partnerships that support successful technology deployments to address transportation problems. For transit needs such as mobility as a service, rail expansion, mobility solutions, connecting people, jobs, and communities are shared priorities. The pandemic has revealed that low-income minority populations make up a large percentage of essential workers. Many of our workers hold multiple jobs and have to commute outside rush hours when transit services are scaled back. Their livelihoods depend on transportation options that accommodate their second and their third working shifts. Looking ahead, mobility as a service, MAS, program integration with public transportation service is expected to promote equitable and mobility options in communities currently dealing with first and last mile mobility changes. Next slide, please. The ultimate goal is to provide convenient, reliable, accessible, safe transit. We also want to ensure equitable transportation options and infrastructures that meet the needs of our vulnerable groups, such as our elderly, disabled, and low income. The planning process required for the use of FTA funds for transit investment includes public outreach requirement, which provides multiple opportunities, engages communities, and prioritizes their needs for funding applications. The benefits of the process include deepening our understanding of communities, increasing our DBE percentages, and making sure that they're getting meaningful work, build community trust and government ability to meet their needs, promote workforce development in our local schools and universities and within our trades, targeting and working with our HBCUs and our predominantly Hispanic institutions as part of hiring strategies. These are all key things to making sure that we have inclusion, diversity, equity, and quality within our transit system across this country. Thank you.
And thank you, Tanya. It's a great reminder to hear about the importance of the Disadvantaged Business Enterprise Program and starting workforce development efforts early. I can tell you that workforce development is a priority for the Secretary, for the whole department, and for FTA especially. Now, I'd like to turn to Harriet Trigoni, Director of the New Urban Mobility Alliance. Harriet has worked on mobility and community development issues for the past 2 decades, including as a Deputy Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development during the Obama administration. Harriet, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you for having me. I wanted to tell you a little bit first about NUMO. It's a global alliance organization, the New Urban Mobility Alliance, that's an outgrowth of something called the Shared Mobility Principles for Livable Cities. As an alliance, we work collectively to harness innovations in mobility to achieve equitable, sustainable, accessible outcomes in cities. I'm honored to be here today to talk about how partnerships can help increase transit ridership and how agencies in the federal government can center equity in new transit investments and service. Next slide. What can transit be doing to get more people on transit? I think that's a question all of us are trying to address. I want to talk about 2 initial elements. The first is understanding that transit is a part of people's mobility, but it may not be all of it. Transit is the second biggest mode share, the big dog in cities and communities where transit service exists, second only to private automobile use. Agencies need to think about all of the people who use transit and how they can make all their travel smoother, easier, and more affordable through partnerships with other mobility providers. Think of what Transport for London does. This includes working on payment integration, on multimodal travel, and the bundling of trips to make attractive pricing possible. The second piece of this is the co-benefits of increased access to mobility, something that this administration is really focusing on. How do we start to partner with NGOs, employers, governments, downtown business districts, and organizations that are looking to realize these co-benefits to figure out how increases in mobility can be paid for and the policies of those partners really aligned with transit? Next slide. Especially before the possibility of money for expanded service, like in the just passed Senate infrastructure bill, one of the phenomena I know we've all been seeing around the country is how communities are looking for ways to expand the transit shed without having to necessarily grow the footprint of transit service. Think of mobility hubs as a next generation of transit-oriented development, bringing together land use, mobility services, information, convenience, whether that's retail or services, all intended to expand the transit shed by giving people the means to get to transit or other destinations that are beyond what would otherwise be normal walking distance. Next slide. Let me give you a couple of examples, starting with Pittsburgh. Move PGH is a first of its kind initiative bringing together several mobility service providers that just got launched in Pittsburgh last month. Move PGH is the first initiative in the US to connect traditional and emerging low-cost shared transportation options into a single easy-to-use system. Travelers can find a bus, a bike, a scooter, a moped, a car, or shared ride using the transit app, or by visiting one of the 50 new mobility hubs throughout the city. Another city, next slide, that's focused on mobility is the fast-growing city of San Antonio. It's a low-density city that is looking to channel its rapid growth into new land use patterns and other strategies that are going to get people to transit. They're looking to their own values and aspirations to locate mobility hubs in ways that address the problems caused by the city's current over-reliance on private auto use, limiting access to opportunity, increasing economic segregation and disparity, constraining wealth creation with people having to make car payments, not house payments, and increasing vulnerability, where lost jobs have been harder to replace. The image on the right is from a workshop we did with the Urban Land Institute and VIA Metropolitan Transit, which is San Antonio's transit agency. We convened stakeholders to collectively establish the criteria the city and VIA would use to determine the very best locations for mobility hubs to increase access to transit. Next slide. I want to close with a discussion of a key partner we can't neglect. That's employers. Some of them are really stepping up their climate ambition and looking specifically at employee travel. The great work from home experiment we've all been living really showed the power of employer policies with respect to the how, when, and whether of commuting. This is also a moment when many employers are conscious of inequity between benefits that white-collar workers who can work from home are getting versus those who have to show up every day. Employers have the ability to experiment with leveling the playing field by providing more benefits that will accrue to people who have to come into work, which could and should include transit benefits. We did an experiment in Detroit during COVID where we partnered with the city and employers to help address this mobility gap using e-bikes to help connect people to transit and jobs. The pilot provided individually leased e-bikes to employees of hospitals, nursing homes, grocery stores, and pharmacies at a highly subsidized rate. Another example is Amazon, a company who recently announced new transportation benefits to their employees. They're paying corporate employees $350 a month to cover the cost of e-biking to work, including rentals, maintenance, and parking at public transit. Thanks so much, and I look forward to hearing Paul from the rest of our speakers.
And thank you, Harriet. Those are some great examples of ideas to expand our community partners while we improve mobility using a centralized hub strategy. Now I'd like to turn to Benji De La Pena, Chief Executive Officer of the Shared Use Mobility Center. The Shared Use Mobility Center works through a cooperative agreement with FTA to share knowledge about the latest efforts to advance mobility innovations through information sharing, peer exchange, and collaborative problem solving. This partnership has supported FTA's demonstration programs and communities for several years, helping encourage innovation in public transportation across the country. Benji?
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for all the other speakers that have so readily framed the issues that we are all facing. Next slide, please. So the Shared Use Mobility Center, as Paul said, we are a public interest organization working to make multimodal transportation systems work for all. The Shared Use Mobility Center is headquartered in Chicago, located on the traditional and unceded homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi tribes. For the benefit of our visually impaired participants, let me describe how I appear on the screen. I am a middle-aged Asian man with brown skin and short black hair. I'm wearing black rim glasses and a light blue shirt. So what do we do at Shared Use Mobility Center? This sector, transit, shared use, is rapidly being disrupted. It has been for the last 2 decades and continues to be. And so we're working to shape shared mobility services and infrastructure. We convene key stakeholders, including transit, in this rapidly evolving and growing sector. As Paul mentioned, we work with the FTA, particularly with the Office of Research, Demonstration, and Innovation, partnering with about 70 communities and transit agencies on their innovations and bringing them together to learn from each other. From the community side, one of our major projects is working with the California Air Resources Board's Clean Mobility Options Program. And that's bringing the needs of the communities that have been historically neglected and ignored by transit, and coming up with shared mobility options, zero emission, to serve the communities. Next slide, please. So this point is already made, but I will underscore it. Shared mobility can address equity goals, serving historically and neglected and discriminated communities. If you can see my background is a video of the I-5 in Seattle. That is what we inherit. That is not sustainable, and we cannot continue building this. And that signals to everyone that the way to move is by car. And faced with the code red of the climate crisis and the long history of inequality in this country, we cannot continue doing this. We have to change. Mobility, the first thing to do is to admit that mobility is a critical utility in cities, towns, and rural areas. The lack of mobility and lack of access is a lack of access to opportunity and community. And so changing the frame to thinking about mobility as a utility means we don't think so much about how much ridership we get, but how available the service is. If you take the metaphor and say, I'm sorry, you only have 5 lamps and a electric burner, you only get 1 hour of electricity per day. Or I'm sorry, you only wash dishes once a day, we'll only give you water once a day. That should not be the case for transportation. It should not be the case for transit mobility. We have to make it available and readily accessible. And shared mobility, as Harriet said, expands transit's use and reach. And there are many strategies to do this, but they have to work in partnership. And there's a growing demand for on-demand transit services, and transit agencies need to master that, and that requires information flow. What the COVID pandemic did was it accelerated trends that were already underway. So it's exacerbating it. At the same time, we could see that transit agencies could rapidly adapt. Next slide, please. So what the FTA should work on, listen. And one of the things that I like to talk about is don't measure the number of consultations you have, measure the number of conversations you're maintaining, right? So very often we do consultation theater. How many did we meet? How many people were there? What we need to do is maintain conversations and track how many people are we talking to, what has changed in our thinking because of those conversations. And conversations are not yes, no answers. They are always, what do you think? What do we think? And we engage. We need to help agencies turn innovations from pilots into permanent programs. That means dedicating resources, budget, personnel, and power. And they're not just shiny things that we take on, and then when the funding ends, sorry, we're not going to do it anymore. We need to connect transit to shared on-demand services, and we need to look at the data and go beyond the downtown commute. So much of travel across our communities are not captured by our data, particularly the way women travel for the daily needs and for caring for their homes and their families. And also, again, underscoring what Harriet said, mobility hubs are the physical instantiation of this new mobility service. Seeing it, feeling it next to our communities makes it even more available and can counter signal the kind of highways we see to have mobility and in many forms available nearby. And we need to move with speed and purpose. We really do not have time. We've wasted too much time already addressing equity. We have so little time left to be able to make a difference in averting the climate crisis, which is already here. Next slide, please. So last point to make is information is infrastructure. Shared mobility is driven by information, and this ability to manage information is something that transit agencies need to learn. And most transit agencies treat information as tools rather than assets. Tools meaning if you have a wrench nearby, you can have a wrench too. Everyone can have a wrench. Pretty soon we don't know what's the right wrench, and you can't do that with information. What we need is for agencies to understand the cost of that information and the cost of not having that information. Information is also visual, it's spatial, it's physical, it's cultural, it's social. And so what are we really doing to train this generation that's not like the new generation, that's not like driving cars? What are we doing to train them to use transit and shared mobility? Lastly, it's a critical organizational capacity that requires plans and investments. I see very few agencies that actually have a plan and a strategy for information. Information investments, in fact, all transit investments should be driven by climate and equity goals. If you have a project that does not have climate and equity goals and a way to measure the outcomes, that's no good. That should not be accepted. Lastly, with the words from Melvin Katzenberg, when it comes to both shared mobility and technology, technology is neither good nor bad, but nor is it neutral. Thank you.
And thank you, Benji. Thank you for all that you do to advance FTA's research on innovative mobility and to promote equity throughout the nation's transit system. Now I'd like to introduce our third and final panel. These folks join us from advocacy organizations that work in the transit space. We'll start with John Yee, Executive Director of Los Angeles Walks. John?
Great, thank you, Paul. Hi, everyone. My name is John Yee. I'm with Los Angeles Walks. My pronouns are he, him, his. Los Angeles Walks is LA's premier advocacy group around pedestrian issues. More succinctly put, we are community organizers in the space. We work primarily with communities of color, immigrant communities, monolingual Angelenos, in securing basic life-saving pedestrian infrastructure. So that's a bit about who we are. Next slide, please. So just to set a baseline, I'm not going to read all these statistics, but just so we're all coming from the same space of at least Los Angeles, every 36 hours, well, now it's actually 30. Every 30 hours, an Angeleno is killed in a car crash. About 40% of our sidewalks have a D to F grade, and we have almost less than 25% of our streets equipped with bus stops and shelter. So this is an everyday reality for a lot of our community members that we work with. Next slide. And so today, I know we're talking about community partnerships. And so for me to do that, I think the best way I feel like we can share that is to share with you how we do our work here at Los Angeles Walks. And so I think a good place to begin is our theory of change. So our theory of change is pretty simple. It's one of two steps. First is we win safe street infrastructure. So as organizers, we partner with communities in securing basic life-saving infrastructure, such as speed humps, stop sign, curb ramps, flat sidewalks. And I'm sure many of you know on this call, who especially work on the municipal level, basic safe street infrastructure can be incredibly difficult to come by. A story that I often share is a speed hump can take over a year for a lot of our community members. And it's even more difficult if you don't speak English and you don't have the social or political capital to sort of navigate that system. And so as organizers in this space, we partner with communities in navigating these city systems. Next slide, please. And the second step of our theory of change is as we do these hyperlocal sort of block by block organizing campaigns, we leverage that experience then to get our community members into positions of power. So whether that's running for local neighborhood councils, getting appointments to city committees, on the bottom right, there's a photo of the LA Pedestrian Advisory Committee. And so we actually work to get our members appointed to that. But for us, that is perhaps the most ultimate manifestation of community partnerships, right? It's having our communities actually in positions of power. I can't think of any better way to build a partnership with a community than actually placing some of those community members into decision-making positions. And so it goes beyond just checking a box, beyond just having a translator at a meeting, beyond just providing a flyer that's in English and Spanish and Korean and Chinese. It's actually empowering and giving communities positions to make decisions for themselves. For us, that is the ultimate way we build partnerships with communities. Next slide, please. So this takes me now into like, how does it actually look like on the ground? And so Los Angeles Walks, we've developed what we call a Safe Street Promotora Educator Program. For some of you on this call, you may recognize the word promotora. It's often used in the public health setting. And so we were very intentional about bringing this model of community engagement and organizing into the transportation space. You know, just like how when it comes to health insurance, access to healthcare, you know, healthy produce options, those are resources that promotoras bring into the community because they have the language skills, the cultural language, the cultural sort of knowledge of the community. In the same way, our promotoras bring in transportation resources into the community. So they are wizards at navigating city bureaucracies. They know which city council member to talk to, which staffer at different agencies to bring in on certain projects. And so they take that knowledge and give those resources to their communities and to their neighbors. And so for us, it's not just about navigating systems, but really putting in resources in communities where there's a high need. And at Los Angeles, it's primarily immigrant communities, non-English speaking communities, and communities of color. And one thing I want to add to this is, oftentimes in the context of community engagement, people always talk about, you know, you have to build community capacity. And, you know, I always like to say, who are we building community capacity for? Because oftentimes when people say we need to build community capacity, what they really mean is we need to get immigrant communities or non-English speaking communities to better engage people in power who are primarily men and English speaking and online. And oftentimes I think that's an unfair sort of game we're playing. And so when we talk about community capacity, building capacity, we also have to talk about how do we build government's capacity to engage community. And a great example, and I forgot the speaker, so some of the speakers have mentioned already about how WhatsApp is incredibly popular amongst the Spanish-speaking community. You know, if there's anyone Korean who's Korean American on this webinar, they most likely on their phone will have an app called Kakao Talk. It's incredibly popular amongst Korean Americans. And I've seen Korean American community here in Koreatown really organize around that tool. But then when for some reason there's a policy objective on the city or county level and these organizers come to the Korean community, they're like, you have to get on Twitter. You have to know how to engage on Zoom. And there's all these other tools. And so when they look at the Korean American community, they're like, your capacity isn't built. When in actuality, we have our own tools to engage and organize. And so for me, that's a really great example of how not only do communities need to build their own tools, but government, FTA, folks who work at these agencies themselves also have to build those tools. And so I really encourage folks to, and especially those people in positions of power, to explore these different tools to engage communities in a more thorough way that's more equal and equitable. Next slide, please. And I just want to conclude with this. I think when I set the slide over, it kind of got morphed, so I'll read the quote out. But in general, public transit is a lifeline for so many of us, especially for those without political and social capital. In Los Angeles, the reality is we've racially segregated how we move. You know, people in cars versus people in trains and subways. And majority of the ridership is Latino, Black, majority of the ridership is female. While most of the people making the decisions who really get to influence budgets are not from those communities. And so this isn't just about movement and mobility, but about equity and social justice. And I think a lot of my colleagues on this call have sort of really honed in on that. So I'll end with this quote. The pedestrian is nobody in the city. He or she has been forgotten by authorities and our own citizenry. The curious and paradoxical thing is that we are all pedestrians at some moment. As such, we have forgotten ourselves. And this comes from Beatonito, who was our summer fellow. And just Google him. He does a lot of cool stuff on pedestrian advocacy work. So I'll end it there and back to you, Paul.
Thank you, John. And as a former congressional staffer who worked in the LA area, thanks for all that great information about how Los Angeles is working to promote safer streets. Those are some creative strategies. Now we'll turn it over to Hester Cerebrant, Policy Director for the Transportation Choices Coalition based in Seattle, Washington. Hester?
Thank you, Paul. Hi, thank you for having me. My name is Hester Cerebrant, and I'm the Policy Director at Transportation Choices out here in Seattle, Washington. Hi, Linda. And I'm here to talk to you about partnerships between transit agencies and nonprofits. Next slide. At TCC, we believe that a connected and vibrant transportation system exists at the intersection of economic vitality, environmental stewardship, social equity, and public health. We're a nonprofit advocacy group that works in Washington state at all levels of government. Next slide. We're a small but mighty team, and so with so much to cover, we're really focused on upstream policies and systemic change. Most of the work we do falls in these buckets: getting more and more progressive funding for sustainable transportation like transit, policies that make transit more affordable, reliable, and frequent, helping government adopt frameworks for values-based decision-making and spending, and changes that help institutionalize racial and social equity. Next slide. Like many nonprofits, we do this through a mix of research, education, advocacy, and campaigns. But one of our most important strategies is our coalition and agency partnerships. Next slide. I probably don't need to tell you why partnerships between agencies and advocacy organizations is so important, but trust building, information sharing, and creating a network of committed supporters come to mind as top reasons to invest in this work. Next slide. So at Transportation Choices, I think the way we foster partnerships is really unique. We're focused on breaking down barriers between agencies and nonprofits, breaking down silos between different agencies, creating a new kind of space and place for engagement and collaboration. It's more in-depth and reciprocal than agencies are usually able to engage with the general public, but it's appropriate for nonprofit staff that come from a variety of sectors: health, social justice, housing, land use, those that aren't necessarily technical transportation experts. As a white-led organization with a lot of power and a long history of working directly with other folks that have power, one way we can leverage that is using our capacity and connections to create tables that are open to all and really provide direct access to policymakers. So most of the tables we set are a variation of a theme. We bring together agency staff and nonprofit staff for regular meetings and do a mix of agency presentations, nonprofit feedback, and shared policy development. You can see some of the examples of tables we host here. For example, we have a weekly call that is open to anyone in the state where we give an overview of what's going on in Washington transportation, and we hear from agencies about projects they want to get feedback on. We hear from nonprofits on campaigns or events they're working on, and it's a great place to network and get up to speed. We also have a table focused just on the intersection of new mobility, tech-enabled transportation, and how that impacts and should be informed by equity. That's actually nonprofit folks and staff from multiple different agencies, and they're all sharing information with each other and finding opportunities to collaborate. We did a lot of visioning exercises together with everyone in the beginning, which helped build trust on the nonprofit side in particular, showing that we were really all working towards the same goals. And then we have agency-specific tables where we have regularly set meetings that alternate between advocates only, where we can strategize together, and advocates meeting with agency staff. Advocates really drive the agenda either way, and agency staff come prepared to discuss what they're working on, answer questions, and offer feedback on how we can get engaged. Next slide, please. This work has been critical in creating coalitions of nonprofits that then were able to enthusiastically support transportation ballot measures and other legislation because they were directly involved in the policy development process, start to finish. But it's not just ballot measures and legislation, it's policy change related to fair enforcement, equity strategies, and more. Next slide. So here's my call to action for you. There's no reason not to partner early, often, and with openness and vulnerability with your local advocates. Thank you so much. Back to you, Paul.
Thank you, Hester. That's terrific insight in the way you've worked with people in the Puget Sound region. Some great strategies others might apply in their areas as well. Now we can turn to our final panelist, Corrine Kisner, Executive Director of Nacto, the National Association of City Transportation Officials. Corrine?
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for having me today. I'm Corrine Kistner, the Executive Director of Nacto, an association of North American city transportation departments and transit agencies focused on designing our streets for sustainable, equitable transportation options, including reliable and fast transit. As many of the speakers before me have said, transit is the most efficient, affordable, and sustainable way to get around cities, large and small. At a time of mounting urgency to address the climate crisis and racial injustice, now is the time for government agencies to invest in the transit priority strategies that we know will revive ridership and pave the way for a greener and more equitable future. Investing in bus priority is critical for climate action and addressing growing inequality. Nationally, transit riders, a majority of whom are people of color, spend a higher portion of their income on transportation, only to experience longer commutes and greater public health risks. Next slide, please. We know that investing in transit priority pays off. Cities like San Francisco that have invested in network improvements and bus priority street design have successfully cut travel times, improved reliability, expanded access, and increased ridership. Ridership on Muni Rapid lines increased 23% between 2015 and 2019, despite ridership nationally declining in that same period. And San Francisco is not alone. Investments in frequent all-day service have paid off in cities from Las Vegas to Austin to Columbus. Transit's revival will depend on scaling up these initiatives, and in many cities and regions, that's going to require state and federal support. It's critical FTA continues to support network redesign efforts and invest in projects that expand access to opportunity and improve transit reliability. Next slide, please. Paint and posts and partnerships can go a long way. While cone pilots like this dedicated bus lane in Boston may be temporary, when cities, agencies, and communities come together to test new street designs, they can help launch much needed permanent bus priority measures. In Boston, research by the regional MPO revealed that Black transit riders spend 64 more hours a year on MBTA buses compared to white transit riders. Leveraging this research finding, local advocacy group Livable Streets Alliance played an active role in engaging and surveying transit riders for the Washington Street bus lane pilot. Their outreach was critical to swaying city officials and making the case for bus priority improvements, not just in Roslindale, but across the region on the grounds of racial equity. Pilots of dedicated transit lanes and other lower cost bus priority improvements can have a big impact. In this case, it saved riders as much as 7 minutes on their morning commutes. So what will it take to see more projects like this proven success story? Cities and transit agencies struggle to scale these programs that are proven to increase ridership because of local funding constraints and regulatory barriers. Local match and environmental review requirements are too cumbersome, and many cities and agencies lack the capacity and financial resources to apply for existing grant programs, even if their projects are eligible. FTA can help bridge this gap by reducing local match requirements and refining funding programs so that tactical bus lane projects like this one would be eligible. We cannot achieve transportation equity without bus priority, and it's critical that FTA funding and regulatory requirements are set up to prioritize the projects that are most cost-effective and proven to revive ridership. Next slide, please. The Better Bus Coalition, a local advocacy organization in Cincinnati, brought together community perspectives to develop a vision for better transit. Their vision, published in 2017, was critical for refining SORTA's Reinventing Metro Plan and the passage of last year's transit referendum, which includes a sales and earnings tax that nearly doubles the local revenue available to support transit and roadway maintenance. The Reinventing Metro Plan will provide access to 740 more employers and 20,000 more jobs. The plan's emphasis on access is thanks to the Better Bus Coalition and their efforts to elevate riders' voices, especially the 10% of households in Hamilton County with limited access to a car. Local initiatives like this one are critical, but as federal pandemic recovery funds expire, they'll be unable to maintain and expand transit systems at the scale required to reduce our reliance on driving and address the climate crisis. Federal operating support for agencies large and small is necessary to make reliable transit accessible to all Americans. Next slide, please. So what will it take to achieve a greener and more equitable transportation system? The pandemic emphasized the essential role transit plays and underscored the need for stable, reliable transit funding. However, nationwide transit access remains sparse, and even in cities with robust transit options like Chicago, you can access 7 times more jobs by car than you can by transit in 45 minutes. Resources like the dashboard seen here from Transit Center are an important tool for cities and transit agencies and can help guide policy decisions and future investments. For a car to no longer be a prerequisite to high-paying jobs and higher education, we need to measure and expand transit access. The FTA can build off the efforts of Transit Center and other researchers to create a common methodology for measuring access to guide future federal investments and local decision makings. Federal programs should also prioritize investments in the improvements that matter most to riders: access to reliable transit, safe walking and biking connections to transit, frequency, and 24-hour service. Nacto will continue to convene cities and transit agencies and encourage them to empower community and advocacy organizations to ensure their transit plans prioritize community needs and address transportation equity concerns. The federal government, as our partner, can support cities and transit agencies by funding multimodal projects that are proven to improve safety and expand access, and by limiting support for projects like roadway construction or highway expansion that conflict with the administration and city's climate, equity, and safety goals. We look forward to working with our members and FTA to identify those funding and regulatory barriers that cities and agencies face when attempting to expand and improve their transit systems. And we will continue seeking opportunities to refine current programs to support transit's recovery and revive ridership. Thank you for having me, and back to you, Paul.
Thanks, Corrine. At FTA, we absolutely look forward to working with Nacto. Before we start with our Q&A, I do want to note the exciting moment we're in that was talked about earlier in our discussion. The Senate passed the bipartisan infrastructure bill last week, and as part of approximately $550 billion in federal investments in America's infrastructure, the bill includes what will be the largest federal investment in transit in our nation's history. So we'll continue to work with Congress to ensure the bill passes. Then we're going to work with grant recipients and those competing for federal discretionary grants to make sure the projects really serve the communities they're in. This administration is pledged to promote equity in everything we do. The bipartisan infrastructure deal provides an unprecedented opportunity to do exactly that. We've heard today how important transit is in communities across the nation, as well as the inverse. Communities are vital in supporting transit ridership. So let's see if we can dig a little deeper into that with a few questions I'd like to pose to our panelists. If everybody can please limit your answer to about a minute, so everyone has a chance. We'll move to our first question. We'd love for you to describe the best transit community partnerships you've seen. And we'll start with Jerry Hope, move to Jim Derwinski, and then finally, Alva Carrasco. Gary? Gary?
Yes. I do not have a video, but would you restate that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. We wanted to find out the best transit community partnerships that you've seen.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I hesitate to speak for other transit operations, but I will speak for Sitka Tribe of Alaska's transit operation. When I first got on here in 2007, 2008, the go-to word was coordination in the department and the Federal Transit Administration. So we tried our very best to do a coordination. We started with a nonprofit organization that the community had requested and encouraged, as there was some organizational meetings prior to getting started, that the nonprofit Center for Community go ahead and do the application. So they did that with the State of Alaska DOT. They in turn did receive the funding, but they opted to contract out the fixed route with Sitka Tribe of Alaska, and then the paratransit with the Catholic Community Services that was operated by a local senior center. We are coordinated then with the city and borough of Sitka in terms of their contribution and help and assistance with the paratransit. And the Sitka Tribe of Alaska also contributes from the Tribal Transportation Program for some of the match. And also there was a number of other coordinated efforts that is primarily with the match that is contributed for parking that is done with grocery stores, private businesses, governments, education facilities with the public schools and the university. So we coordinate as much as we best could in an area that the city and borough, which is a combined government and the municipality here in Sitka, who opted not to operate the public transit system. So even with that, there is a really good coordinated effort and as best that we possibly could here in Sitka. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. And we'll move on to Jim Derwinski. Jim?
Yeah, thank you. I think if I had to pick one, it would be the Fair Transit South Cook pilot that we're currently running right now. When Metro was formed and the other service agencies in the region were formed, we really were independent, doing different things. And the idea of coming together and finally moving toward fair integration is really been because of Cook County pulling this together as a funding source and also as a partner in making sure that we're messaging to areas of the region that are really more transit dependent. It's a phenomenal beginning of a project. I can't wait to see this thing expand, not only here in Illinois, but I think it could be a model for many other areas across the country. Cook County also has been a funding partner in infrastructure. So that would be my example.
Thanks, Jim. And Alva?
Hi, my example that comes to mind is for Via Metro, when we did our COA, comprehensive operations analysis for Via service while I worked there. What I really thought was critical, especially for Latino communities, was the team paid extra attention to making sure that everybody had a seat at the table. So it wasn't just the Latino community members, but it was also advocates and different leaders from different neighborhoods in the county. Bexar County is a small county, but it's pretty spread out, and you have different neighborhoods throughout the county. I liked that they took extra care and made it more like a retreat versus having just a meeting where you slap a slide deck and provide coffee. It was very interactive. There was good food provided to the participants. I believe there were stipends, but I can't really remember for sure, but it was very well attended, and the makeup was so diverse that I thought that was very well done. And the consulting group that provided those services did a phenomenal job in making everybody feel engaged or being very inclusive as to the future of the services in their community. So I really give kudos to San Antonio for a lot of the different best practices that I talked about for applying them.
Great, thanks, Alva. Our second questions will go to John Yee, Hester Cerebrant, and Corrine Kisner. Traditionally, transit has been seen as a commuter resource only. How do you see transit used in your community outside that normal 9 to 5? And we'll start with John Yee.
Yeah, I mean, a simple way to answer that question is, what do you use your car for? I mean, everything from basic life should be used on transit. So everything from family needs to visiting family, access to healthcare, fresh produce, education, getting to and from school. And also, I think it's important to say leisure as well. I mean, be able to go to the local park, to go to the beach, at least here in Los Angeles, to visit your neighbors in other parts of the city. And so I think I know, especially a lot of folks on this call probably are car drivers, but whatever you use your car for, that should be the same sort of view that we view public transit. Are we giving access to life and living on our buses and trains? So that's how I would answer that question.
Thanks, John. And Hester?
It's funny, I had written down in my notes, not to be glib, but how do you see cars used in your community? So thank you, John. In Washington, 20 to 25% of people don't or can't drive, and these folks need the bus for every use you can think of. Every trip that needs to be made by car, it's critical to be able to be done by transit for those who ride to have full and enriching lives. But I will take a quick moment to mention just how much transit has stepped up in the healthcare realm in the past year and a half. A lot of great partnerships have popped up even in the past 6 months to get people to vaccine appointments. And then over the year and a half, a real innovation among transit agencies and mobility managers to get people to healthcare appointments during a really fraught time for healthcare. Thanks.
Thank you, Hester. And Corrine?
Yeah, I'll echo John and Hester. I think it's easy to lose sight of the fact that the majority of trips are not in fact commute trips. They're trips to school, to the grocery store, healthcare, family and friends, and transit, especially bus-based systems have never been solely a commuter service. So I think it's really critical that we recognize that evaluating and optimizing transportation systems for the 9 to 5 white collar commuting has really led to disparities in who has access to reliable and frequent transit, which has disproportionate impacts for communities of color and for women. So that's why it's so important that we measure access to destinations and access to opportunities broadly and not just for commute trips.
Thanks, Corrine. And our final set of questions will be for Tanya, Harriet, and Benji. And the question is, how do we encourage equity as we renew transit ridership? And Tanya Adams, we'll begin with you.
I want to hit on three topics really quick. The shared mobility for those who can't afford personal transportation. You know, that partnership for the last mile connections and making sure the frequency throughout the day. The other part is considering the full population, including our elderly, disabled, and low income. We conceive new programs and cost models. Also, walking, biking, and ride shares, making sure that they all work together and making sure that our riders get to where they need to get in a desired time frame. And the last one is equity across the geography, where our projects are selected and funded, considering a diverse set of criteria. I think that is key to making sure that we're able to get our ride share working.
Thanks, Tanya. And Harriet Trigoni?
Thank you so much. That's a great question. What I would say is, in light of what you mentioned, Paul, the historic infrastructure bill just passed in the Senate, we'll be talking about more transit service, which is fabulous, right? But because the administration has promised to focus on poorly served neighborhoods, a foreseeable impact is increased land values and threats of displacement, potentially undermining all of our efforts to increase equity. It's great to have new funding to cover the investments, but we also need new partners and really co-investors, like cities making different land use decisions, employers making location decisions to support transit, and nonprofits who provide affordable housing and help organize communities around ways to ensure people can stay in and benefit from changes in accessibility coming to their neighborhoods. How FTA gives out the funding could be fundamental to creating and supporting these new and absolutely necessary partnerships. Thank you.
Thank you, Harriet. And Benji De La Pena to close us out.
I would echo what the previous speaker said, but I would take this at the level of plan requirements, right? So I go back, every plan should have equity goals and a very clear way of measuring that. And every plan's discussion should talk about the historic hurt and damage that previous transportation decisions and transportation investments have done to the community. Only by acknowledging the past can we really look at, well, what is the impact of this new expansion of the service? And as Harriet said, there's a ton of money coming. One of the things we learned in Seattle when I was working for the Seattle Department of Transportation is when you put the investments in and buy bus service and make that bus service more frequent, people will use it. So make those investments, find a way to find new sources of money, use the investments that are coming from federal government to expand the services. And lastly, really it is, as this session is about listening, right? Asking the community, not just relying on our maps and the data we collect, asking what is the data we don't have and who is not in the table. I don't think we need to encourage equity. That's too weak. We need to build it. We need to respond to it. It has to be issue number one, right? Equal to issue number one of the climate crisis.
Thanks, Benji. And thank you to everybody who participated in our panels today. It's an amazing set of ideas that we are going to be listening to. And we appreciate everyone's participation, including those of you in the audience. I hope you'll continue to join us at our final session of our national conversation when we wrap up and summarize everything we've heard at a Transit Renewal Initiative Summit on August 27th. Please register for that on our website. Now to close our listening session, I'll turn it over to Kelly Brookins, FTA's Region 5 Administrator. Kelly?
Hello, everyone. I'm Kelly Brookins, joining you from Chicago. I'm so encouraged by what each of the speakers have shared this afternoon. And it was great to hear, especially from our partners in Chicago, Tanya Adams from Compto, Jim Bowinski from Metra, and Benji De La Pena from the Shared Use Mobility Center. Although it's never a surprise, I continue to be amazed at the knowledge and creativity of our transit partners that they bring to the table every day. Before we break, I want to provide you with one additional example in Region 5. Our largest grantee is Chicago Transit Authority. I'm proud of CTA's work in the community, especially during the pandemic. To improve vaccination rates here and expand them to the vulnerable population and groups, CTA partnered with the Chicago Public Schools and the Chicago Department of Health. They converted a transit bus to create a rolling vaccine clinic. And on its first day last March, the bus vaccinated close to 100 people at a city senior center. The mobile clinic is the Vax Shy Nation bus, and it's also visited schools across the city to focus on children ages 12 and up, which is another critical group to receive the vaccines. Ridership on the Chicago Transit Authority system has doubled since the start of the year, and it continues to grow. Since January, total ridership has increased by 56% to 4 million rides per week. This increase was driven by rail ridership, which was up 94%, in part thanks to the Chicago Transit Authority's When You're Ready, We're Ready, which was an outreach campaign promoting the safety protocols, station improvement program, as well as summer discount fares. CTA's work with the community and its laser focus on safety and service has not gone by unnoticed. The American Public Transportation Association recognized CTA in July as the nation's best large transit agency for its work to manage service during the pandemic. APTA also named CTA President Dorval Carter as Top Transit Executive of the Year, a rare double honor. I'm proud to work closely with professionals like Dorval and the rest of the CTA team. And with that, in my role as the last speaker, I thank everyone who presented today and participated in the Q&A. And also, I express appreciation on behalf of FTA Administrator Fernandez to everyone who took time out of their busy schedules to tune in and listen. FTA is committed to helping renew ridership, and we know all of you are too.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you again to everyone. Before we close today, I'll draw your attention to the list of all the organizations we've heard from today. You may want to take a screenshot of this image for future reference. Also, we plan to post this presentation and the recording on our website. We look forward to hearing from you at transitsopen.gov. That's transitsopen.gov. I also encourage you to follow FTA's social media accounts, where we'll be highlighting many of the best practices and transit agencies that you've heard from today. Thank you very much for your time, and from Washington, thank you on behalf of the Federal Transit Administration.